Welcome, dear viewers, to a One Storyteller, where every tale is a journey and every journey is a revelation. Tonight we bring you a story that will grip your heart, challenge your mind, and leave you questioning the very fabric of justice and humanity. A story so powerful, so shocking, it will echo in your thoughts long after the final word is spoken. So sit back, relax, and let us take you into a world where courage meets chaos, and where one woman's verdict changes everything. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in Willow Creek, a small town nestled in the heart of the Midwest, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and crime was something that happened on the news, not in their streets. The sun had just set, casting a golden glow over the town as people began to settle in for the night. But for Officer Linda Carter, the night was just beginning. Officer Carter had been with the Willow Creek Police Department for over a decade. She was a respected member of the force, known for her dedication, her kindness, and her unwavering commitment to justice. At 35 years old, she had seen her fair share of challenges, but she had always faced them with courage and determination. That night, she was on routine patrol, driving slowly through the quiet streets, her eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. The radio crackled occasionally with updates from dispatch, but for the most part, the night was uneventful. That is, until she turned onto Maple Street. Maple Street was usually quiet, lined with small businesses that closed early and a few scattered houses. But as Officer Carter approached the corner, she noticed a group of 4 men loitering outside a closed convenience store. They were loud, their voices carrying through the still night air, and their body language was aggressive. Even from a distance, she could tell they were intoxicated. She pulled her patrol car to the curb and stepped out, her hand resting lightly on her holster. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You need to move along. This area is closed for the night." The men turned to face her, their expressions a mix of surprise and defiance. They were all white, in their early to mid-20s, and dressed in jeans and hoodies. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head and a sneer on his face, stepped forward. "What's the problem, officer?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "We're just hanging out. Isn't that allowed?" Officer Carter kept her composure. "This is private property, and the store is closed. You need to move along." The men exchanged glances, and then the tall one, Mark Thompson, spoke again. "Or what? You gonna arrest us?" The other men laughed, their voices harsh and mocking. Officer Carter felt a flicker of unease, but she stood her ground. "I'm not gonna ask again. Move along, or I'll have to take you in." What happened next was a blur. Mark Thompson took a step closer, his face contorted with anger. "You think you can tell us what to do?" he spat. "You're nothing but a—" The racial slur hit her like a punch to the gut. Before she could react, the other men joined in, their voices rising in a chorus of hate. They called her names, mocked her authority, and then, without warning, they attacked. Mark lunged at her, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her off balance. Another man, Steve Reynolds, swung a bottle at her head. Officer Carter managed to dodge the worst of it, but the bottle grazed her temple, sending a sharp pain shooting through her skull. She stumbled, but her training kicked in. She fought back, using her baton to fend off the men as she called for backup. The men, emboldened by their numbers and their intoxication, continued to attack. They punched, kicked, and shoved her, their faces twisted with rage. But Officer Carter refused to go down. She fought with everything she had, her determination fueled by a fierce sense of justice. By the time backup arrived, the men had fled, leaving Officer Carter bruised, bloodied, but unbowed. She was taken to the hospital, where she was treated for her injuries, a concussion, a sprained wrist, and numerous cuts and bruises. But the physical wounds were nothing compared to the emotional toll. As she lay in the hospital bed, her mind raced. She thought about the men's faces, their hate-filled eyes, and the words they had hurled at her. She thought about the community she had sworn to protect and the challenges she still faced as a black woman in law enforcement. But most of all, she thought about justice. She knew that this was not just an attack on her, but an attack on everything she stood for, and she was determined to see it through. The security camera outside the convenience store had captured the entire incident. The footage, though grainy, was damning. It showed the men's aggressive body language, the racial slurs that could be read on their lips, and the moment they lunged at Officer Carter. When the video was released to the public, it sparked outrage and disbelief. The town of Willow Creek was shaken to its core. The incident became a flashpoint in the ongoing national conversation about race, policing, and justice. For Officer Carter, it was the beginning of a long and difficult journey, one that would test her strength, her resolve, and her faith in the system she had sworn to uphold. The morning after the attack, Willow Creek was a town on edge. The security camera footage of the assault on Officer Linda Carter had already begun to circulate online, sparking outrage and disbelief. The small town, unaccustomed to such violence, was thrust into the national spotlight. The local police department, under immense pressure to act swiftly, moved quickly to identify and apprehend the perpetrator. The grainy security footage provided the first clues. The four men, though their faces were partially obscured, were recognizable to those who knew them. Mark Thompson, Steve Reynolds, Tom Harris, and Jake Miller were local troublemakers, known for their involvement in petty crimes and their openly racist attitudes. They were frequent patrons of the town's bars, often causing disturbances and clashing with law enforcement. Officer Carter, despite her injuries, worked closely with her colleagues to identify the men. She provided detailed descriptions, and within hours the police had names to go with the faces in the video. The men were well known in the community, and it didn't take long for tips to pour in about their whereabouts. The police moved quickly, determined to bring the men to justice before they could flee or cause further harm. A raid was organized for the early hours of the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. The men were found in a rundown house on the outskirts of town, still reeking of alcohol, and clearly unaware of the storm that was about to descend upon them. The arrest was tense but uneventful. The men, caught off guard, offered little resistance. They were handcuffed and led out of the house, their faces a mixture of confusion and defiance. As they were placed into police cars, one of them, Mark Thompson, shouted, "This is a setup. She started it. We didn't do anything wrong." But the evidence against them was overwhelming. The security footage, combined with Officer Carter's testimony and the accounts of eyewitnesses, left little room for doubt. The men were charged with assault, hate crimes, and obstruction of justice. News of the arrests spread quickly, and the town's reaction was mixed. For many, the arrests were a relief, a sign that justice would be served. But for others, they were a source of tension and division. At the local diner, where the town's residents often gathered to share news and gossip, the attack was the only topic of conversation. Some patrons expressed their support for Officer Carter, praising her bravery and calling for harsh penalties for the men. Others, however, were more sympathetic to the defendants, arguing that they had been unfairly targeted. "They're just kids," one man said, shaking his head. "They made a mistake, but they don't deserve to have their lives ruined over it." "A mistake?" another countered. "They attacked a police officer. They called her racial slurs. That's not a mistake. That's hate." The debate raged on, both in the diner and across the town. The incident had exposed deep-seated racial tensions that many had tried to ignore, and the community was struggling to come to terms with what had happened. As the news spread beyond Willow Creek, the case attracted national attention. News trucks descended on the town, their satellite dishes towering over the courthouse. Reporters from major networks jostled for position, eager to capture every detail of the story. Officer Carter became a symbol of resilience and courage, her face appearing on news programs and social media feeds across the country. The hashtag Justice for Linda began trending, with people from all walks of life expressing their support for her and calling for accountability. But the attention was not entirely positive. The defendants' families, convinced of their innocence, launched a counter-campaign, claiming that the men had been unfairly targeted and that Officer Carter had provoked the confrontation. They appeared on talk shows, gave interviews to sympathetic outlets, and organized rallies to protest the arrests. The men's lawyers, hired by their families, were quick to mount a defense. They argued that the security footage had been taken out of context, that Officer Carter had used excessive force, and that the men had acted in self-defense. They filed motions to have the charges reduced or dismissed, but the judge, citing the strength of the evidence, denied their requests. The stage was set for a contentious trial, one that would pit the town's values against its prejudices, and force the community to confront uncomfortable truths about race, justice, and accountability. Throughout it all, Officer Carter remained steadfast. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that the trial would be grueling, and that the outcome was far from certain. But she was determined to see it through, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been a victim of hate and injustice. "This isn't just about me," she told her colleagues. "This is about sending a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated, that no one should have to go through what I did." Her resolve inspired those around her, and as the trial approached, the community began to rally behind her. They organized vigils, fundraisers, and marches, showing their support for Officer Carter and their commitment to justice. The trial of Mark Thompson, Steve Reynolds, Tom Harris, and Jake Miller was the most anticipated event in Willow Creek's history. The small town, once known for its quiet streets and tight-knit community, was now at the center of a national storm. The case had become a flashpoint in the ongoing conversation about race, policing, and justice in America. The courtroom was packed every day, with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers filling every available seat. The air was thick with tension, and every word, every gesture was scrutinized. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Emily Harris, was determined to leave no room for doubt. They had a mountain of evidence, including the security camera footage that had gone viral, eyewitness testimonies, and Officer Carter's own account of the events. DA Harris opened her case with a powerful statement. "This case is not just about an attack on Officer Linda Carter," she said, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "It is about an attack on the very principles of justice and equality. It is about holding these men accountable for their actions and sending a clear message that hate and violence will not be tolerated." The prosecution's first witness was Officer Carter herself. She took the stand, her uniform crisp, her demeanor calm but resolute. She recounted the events of that night in vivid detail, her voice steady as she described the racial slurs, the physical assault, and the fears she had felt. When the defense tried to rattle her during cross-examination, she held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I was doing my job," she said firmly. "I was trying to keep my community safe, and for that, I was attacked." The prosecution also called on several eyewitnesses, including a store owner who had seen the attack and a passerby who had recorded part of the incident on their phone. Their testimonies painted a clear picture of what had happened, corroborating Officer Carter's account. The defense, led by high-profile attorney Richard Collins, had a difficult task ahead of them. Their strategy was to cast doubt on Officer Carter's credibility and to portray the defendants as victims of a biased system. They argued that Officer Carter had provoked the confrontation, that she had used excessive force, and that the men had acted in self-defense. "This case is not as clear-cut as the prosecution would have you believe," Collins said in his opening statement. "Officer Carter is not the innocent victim she claims to be. She instigated this confrontation, and my clients were simply defending themselves." The defense called on several witnesses, including friends of the defendants, who claimed that Officer Carter had a history of aggressive behavior. They also brought in an expert witness who testified about the psychological effects of perceived threats, suggesting that the men had acted out of fear. But their efforts to undermine Officer Carter's credibility fell flat. The security camera footage was too damning, and the eyewitness testimonies too consistent. The defense's arguments seemed desperate, and the jury appeared unimpressed. The turning point in the trial came when the prosecution played the security camera footage in its entirety. The courtroom fell silent as the video played on the large screen. There was no sound, but the images spoke volumes. The men's aggressive body language, the racial slurs that could be read on their lips, the moment they lunged at Officer Carter, it was all there, captured in stark, unflinching detail. When the video ended, the room was silent. Even the defendants, who had been defiant throughout the trial, seemed to shrink in their seats. The jury's faces were grim, their minds made up. In her closing argument, D.A. Harris drove home the prosecution's case. "This is not a complicated case," she said. "The evidence is clear. These men attacked Officer Carter because of who she is, a black woman in uniform. They attacked her because they believed they could get away with it. But they were wrong. Today you have the power to send a message that hate and violence will not be tolerated. Today you have the power to deliver justice." The defense, in their closing argument, tried one last time to sow doubt. "This case is about more than just what happened that night," Collins said. "It's about fairness, about due process, about giving these men a fair trial. Don't let emotion cloud your judgment. Look at the facts, and you will see that there is reasonable doubt." But the jury had already made up their minds. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. When they finally returned with a verdict, the room fell silent. The foreman stood, his hands trembling slightly as he read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts." The room erupted. Some cheered, some cried, and some sat in stunned silence. But the most powerful moment came when Officer Carter stood to address the court. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "this case was never just about me. It was about every person who has ever been judged by the color of their skin, every officer who has ever been disrespected because of their race, and every individual who has ever been made to feel less than human. Today, justice was served, but the fight is far from over. We must continue to stand together, to fight for what is right, and to ensure that no one else has to endure what I did." Her words resonated far beyond the walls of that courtroom. They became a rallying cry for justice, for equality, and for change. The courtroom was a pressure cooker of emotions. Every seat was filled and the air was thick with anticipation. Reporters lined the walls, their cameras poised to capture every moment. The jury had been deliberating for 3 days and the tension was unbearable. For Officer Linda Carter, the wait was excruciating. She sat in the front row, flanked by her family and fellow officers, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had done everything she could. Now it was out of her hands. The jury room was a small, windowless space, its walls lined with whiteboards and legal documents. The 12 jurors sat around a large table, their faces etched with exhaustion. They had been through hours of testimony, reams of evidence, and countless arguments. Now it was time to decide. The foreman, a middle-aged man named Robert, opened the discussion. "We've all seen the evidence," he said. "We've heard the testimony. Now we need to decide, are the defendants guilty or not guilty?" The room fell silent. For a moment no one spoke. Then, one by one, the jurors began to share their thoughts. "I think they're guilty," said Maria, a young woman who had been taking notes throughout the trial. "The video clearly shows them attacking her. There's no doubt in my mind." "But what about the defense's argument?" countered John, an older man who had been skeptical from the start. "They said she provoked them. Maybe she did." "Provoke them," Maria shot back. "By doing her job, by asking them to disperse. That's not provocation, that's her duty." The debate raged on, with each juror weighing in. Some were convinced of the defendant's guilt while others had doubts. But as the hours passed, the tide began to turn. The evidence was too strong, the video too damning. Slowly but surely, the jurors reached a consensus. When the jury finally returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The judge called for order, and the room fell silent. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper in his trembling hands. "We, the jury," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "find the defendants guilty on all counts." The room erupted. Some cheered, some cried, and some sat in stunned silence. Officer Carter felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of solemnity. This wasn't just a victory for her, it was a victory for justice. The defendants, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence. Mark Thompson, the ringleader, shook his head in disbelief. "This is a travesty," he muttered under his breath, but his words were drowned out by the noise of the courtroom. As the chaos subsided, the judge turned to Officer Carter. "Officer Carter," he said, "would you like to address the court?" She stood, her heart pounding in her chest. She had prepared for this moment, but no amount of preparation could have fully prepared her for the weight of it. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "this case was never just about me. It was about every person who has ever been judged by the color of their skin, every officer who has ever been disrespected because of their race, and every individual who has ever been made to feel less than human. Today, justice was served, but the fight is far from over. We must continue to stand together, to fight for what is right, and to ensure that no one else has to endure what I did." Her words resonated far beyond the walls of that courtroom. They became a rallying cry for justice, for equality, and for change. The sentencing hearing took place a week later. The defendants, now convicted, sat in silence as the judge handed down their sentences. Mark Thompson, Steve Reynolds, Tom Harris, and Jake Miller were each sentenced to 10 years in prison, a verdict that sent shockwaves through their families and supporters. As the gavel came down, Officer Carter felt a sense of closure. But she knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and she was determined to keep fighting. The verdict was a seismic event, not just for Willow Creek, but for the entire nation. It was a rare moment where justice seemed to prevail in a system often criticized for its biases and failures. But as the dust settled, the real work began. The aftermath of the trial was a complex tapestry of healing, resistance, and transformation. Officer Linda Carter returned to her duties 2 weeks after the trial. Her physical wounds had healed, but the emotional scars remained. She was greeted with a mix of admiration and hostility. Many in the community saw her as a hero, a woman who had stood up against hatred and won. But there were others who viewed her as a traitor, someone who had betrayed the trust of the community by taking a stand against her own. Despite the mixed reactions, Carter remained steadfast. She knew that her fight was far from over. She became an advocate for police reform, speaking at town halls, community meetings, and even national conferences. Her message was clear. The system needed to change, and it needed to change now. "I didn't ask for this," she often said. "But if my story can help bring about change, then I'll keep telling it." Her courage inspired others, especially young Black men and women who saw her as a beacon of hope. She received letters from across the country from people who had faced similar struggles and found strength in her story. Willow Creek, once a quiet, tight-knit community, was now a town divided. The trial had exposed deep-seated racial tensions that many had tried to ignore. Some residents were proud of the verdict, seeing it as a step toward justice and equality. Others felt that the men had been unfairly targeted, that the trial was a witch hunt fueled by political correctness. Protests and counter-protests became a regular occurrence. The town square, once a place of celebration, was now a battleground for conflicting ideologies. Local businesses suffered as tourists avoided the town, fearing unrest. The mayor, desperate to restore peace, organized a series of town hall meetings to address the growing divide. But progress was slow, the wounds were deep, and trust was hard to rebuild. It would take more than a few meetings to heal a community that had been torn apart. Mark Thompson, Steve Reynolds, Tom Harris, and Jake Miller were sentenced to 10 years in prison, a verdict that sent shockwaves through their families and supporters. Their lawyers immediately filed an appeal, claiming that the trial had been unfair and that the jury had been biased. In prison, the men struggled to adjust. They were placed in protective custody, as their notoriety made them targets for other inmates. They spent their days reflecting on their actions, though their remorse was questionable. Mark Thompson, the ringleader, maintained his innocence, claiming that he had been set up by a system that hated him. Their families, meanwhile, became outspoken critics of the verdict. They organized rallies, launched online campaigns, and even appeared on national television to plead their case. But their efforts only deepened the divide, as many saw their actions as a refusal to accept responsibility. The case of Officer Linda Carter became a flashpoint in the national conversation about race and policing. It was covered extensively by the media, with pundits and politicians weighing in on both sides. Some saw it as a victory for justice, a sign that the system could work when it needed to. Others saw it as an exception, a rare moment of accountability in a system that often failed to deliver. The case also reignited debates about police reform. Activists pointed to it as evidence of the need for systemic change, while opponents argued that it was an isolated incident that didn't reflect the broader reality. But one thing was clear: the conversation was far from over. In the months following the trial, several states passed new legislation aimed at addressing racial bias in policing. Body cameras became mandatory in many departments, and training programs were updated to include implicit bias training. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless. For Officer Linda Carter, the trial was just the beginning. She continued to serve her community, but her role had expanded. She was no longer just a police officer. She was a symbol of resilience, a voice for the voiceless, and a catalyst for change. She founded the Carter Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting racial equality and police reform. The organization provided resources for victims of racial violence, offered training for law enforcement agencies, and worked to bridge the gap between communities and the police. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. She received numerous awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and was invited to speak at the United Nations. But for Carter, the real reward was seeing the impact of her work. She saw communities come together, she saw young people inspired to make a difference, and she saw hope where there had once been despair. And so, dear viewers, we come to the end of tonight's tale. A story of courage, of justice, and of the power of one woman's voice to change the world. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Remember, every story has the power to inspire, to challenge, and to transform. Until next time, this is A1 Storyteller signing off. Stay curious, stay brave, and keep seeking the stories that matter.